Hi guys, welcome to this video on Act 2, Scene 1 from Macbeth. And in this video, we're going to see some interaction between Macbeth and Banquo, as Macbeth is on his way to murder Duncan. And we're going to see some of Macbeth's inner turmoil around the murder, and certainly some of the ideas around the violence that he... Let's try again. Hi guys, welcome to this video on Act 2, Scene 1 from Macbeth. And in this video, we're going to see some interaction between Macbeth and Banquo as Macbeth is on his way to murder Duncan. Now obviously Macbeth is trying to conceal this, but Banquo is kind of troubled by the experience with the witches and is worrying a little bit about how it's going to impact on Macbeth. And in this way, this scene is a really good example of the differences between Macbeth and Banquo, certainly how they behave and how they have responded to those witches. It's a scene that deals with themes of betrayal, violence, and certainly some of the mental illness that we are going to see featured later on in the play. But before we start looking at the annotation, let's just have a listen to the scene.
How goes the night, boy?
The moon is down. I have not heard the clock.
She goes down at 12.
I take it is later, sir.
Hold. Take my sword. There's husbandry in heaven. The candles are all out. Take thou that too. A heavy summons lies like lead upon me. Yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. Give me my sword. Who's there? In front. What, sir? Not yet at rest? The king's abed. Ye have been in unusual pleasure and sent forth great largesse to your offices. Nay more, your wife he greets withal by the name of most kind hostess, and shut up in measureless content.
Being unprepared, our will became the servant to defect, which else should free have wrought.
All's well. I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth.
I think not of them. Yet, when we can entreat an hour to serve, we'd spend it in some words upon that business. If you would grant the time.
At your kindest leisure.
If you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honor for you.
So I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear. I will be counseled.
Good repose the while.
Thanks, sir. The like to you.
Go, bid thy mistress, when my drink is ready, she strike upon the bell. Get you to bed. Is this a dagger? which I see before me. The handle toward my hand. Come, let me touch thee. Have they not? I need to see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this, which now I drew. The marshals me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses. All else worth, all the rest, see thee still. And on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. For the one half-world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel, the wolf, whose howls his watch thus, with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing stride, toward his design moves, like a ghost. Thou sure and firm-set earth, hear not my steps which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabouts, and take this present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whilst I threat, he lives. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan. If it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell.
Okay, so let's start looking at some of this annotation. Within this scene, remembering we're dealing with themes of betrayal. So this is the betrayal of Duncan by murdering him. It's a betrayal of Banquo by withholding some of Macbeth's feelings and truth. But also, it's a betrayal of that great chain of being, you know, the natural order, and the divine right of kings. The idea that God chose the king. By murdering him, Macbeth is betraying God. The themes of violence, we'll see this particularly in Macbeth's final soliloquy, but these are the violent thoughts that he's having, the violent tendencies, and his intention to murder Duncan in a very violent way, and mental illness. So, at the minute, maybe Macbeth isn't fully mentally ill, as he becomes later on in the play, but a lot of the things that he talks about and the things that he does foreshadow that mental illness. So just bear those three things in mind. Also, remember the idea that Banquo will father a line of kings. This is part of the prophecy, and if the prophecies come true, then potentially Fleance is going to become a king. So let's just look at some of the things Banquo says. Just quickly, when he says to Fleance, "Take my sword," I think there is some symbolism behind that, indicating the passing of power to the next generation. And certainly that links in with the prophecy. You know, if Banquo is going to father a line of kings, then Fleance must become king. When talking about nature, Banquo remarks, there's husbandry in heaven, their candles are all out. So this is the idea that when he looks at the sky, he can't see any stars. So there is a lack of light. Now, we've looked at the symbolism behind darkness and light before, but just remember, darkness represents evil, uncertainty, murder, betrayal, whereas light represents goodness and honour. So he's remarking that goodness and honour have disappeared. This also foreshadows the darkness that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth will put Scotland under when they're king and queen. It also talks about there being a kind of a broken aspect to nature, that stars should be shining but they're not. So nature has been affected. But also, there's lots and lots of stuff to get into in Shakespeare, but also, this is like what Macbeth and Lady Macbeth wanted. They've been asking for darkness to shroud the sky and to be wrapped in the dunny smokes of hell, so that God can't see what they're about to do. Well, that has happened. And this could be the witches casting a spell. It could be fate, that this just happens to be a dark night. And certainly we'll see kind of fate and real life matching up in a later scene. But definitely there are two sides that you could look at for that. He talks about a heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. This shows that Banquo wants to sleep, but he can't. That there is a worry lying on him, and he wishes that he could sleep, but he just can't. This foreshadows the effect of the murder of Duncan on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Whether that is guilt or whether that is a punishment from God, they find themselves unable to sleep. It also represents a subversion of nature again, because sleeping is a very natural thing, and to not be able to sleep indicates that something is wrong with nature. Here we have a really nice line that shows the difference between Banquo and Macbeth. Banquo says, "Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." So Banquo is having cursed thoughts in the same way that Macbeth has bloody thoughts and a mind full of scorpions and all of these other things. I think this is referring to him having negative thoughts after the witch's prophecies, thinking about how can he ensure that he fathers a line of kings. You know, he could do something that Macbeth does. He could commit a violent act. He could murder Macbeth, Malcolm, Duncan. He could do lots of things, but he asks to be restrained. He doesn't want to give way to these thoughts. He wants to resist, which is very much unlike Macbeth. Macbeth gives himself over to these horrible thoughts. Okay, so then Macbeth comes into the scene. He's obviously sneaking away to murder Duncan. So this is quite an awkward scene. But before we look at their interaction proper, we get a few points around Duncan as a king. Banquo mentions he's in unusual pleasure, which is ironic considering what's about to happen. But it also shows Duncan's over-trusting character. You know, it makes him seem, again, like quite a light-hearted king. And then we see that Duncan continues to be generous. He sends forth great largesse, he gives good compliments, and he offers them a diamond. That wasn't in the scene. I'm not sure why they cut it out, but Duncan continues to be a generous king, even just before he dies. That kind of emphasises the awfulness of Macbeth's betrayal. Okay, so within the rest of this conversation, we need to consider how are Macbeth and Banquo different in the way they deal with the witch's prophecies. We've already seen that Banquo wants to be restrained, whereas Macbeth gives himself over to it, as we'll see in the final soliloquy. Macbeth, you know, he foreshadows some elements of treason, where he talks about, "Our will became the servant to defect." He's not saying that he is committing treason, but I think just the use of the word defect, it kind of links. And you'll see that Macbeth, in his language choices, he quite often subtly gives the game away, and I think that's one of the ways he does here. But Banquo doesn't think that's going to happen, so, you know, he doesn't notice. Then Banquo says that, "I dreamed last night of the three weird sisters." So this again is another difference between Macbeth and Banquo. The witches are very much on his mind, and he's being very, very honest. Macbeth is not honest. He says, "I think not of them." He lies to Banquo about how much time he spent thinking about those prophecies. So that is a key difference. Also, you know, I think, just as a fun thing, we could think about what was the dream. What dream did he have about the weird sisters? Were they trying to control Banquo in his sleep? Was it something around the prophecies? We'll never know. It's just an interesting point, because we don't see things from Banquo's perspective, so we don't know what he's thinking or what he's dreaming really. Macbeth is very dismissive of this. He asks if he would grant the time that he would like to have a chat about the witches, bringing back that motif of time. They never will find the time to talk about the witches again, really. They will never find the time to sit together and chat, because Macbeth's going to murder Banquo. So time here again is like this nondescript, vague point in the future. So yeah, the nature of time, it's not very concrete. He then uses this violent verb, if you shall cleave to my consent, when 'tis it shall make honour for you. So he's saying, if you talk to me about them, then it will be good for you to do. But he uses that violent verb cleave, foreshadowing some of the violence that will be perpetrated against Banquo. So in talking about honour, Banquo says, so I lose none in seeking to augment it. He's saying that he loses no honour in trying to increase his honour, because in trying to increase his honour, all he's got to do is have more children, according to the prophecies. So there's nothing that he's going to do that's going to be dishonourable, and that allows him to remain loyal to Duncan, and allegiance clear. So Banquo is deciding to, do nothing about the prophecies, just continue living his life. This again is a direct contrast to what Macbeth is doing with those prophecies. Macbeth is about to go and commit a really violent, awful act. Okay, so then Banquo leaves, and we get, this is a really important soliloquy in the play. We're going to look at a lot of points about this. This could come up as an exam extract, so try and get as much down of this as you can. Macbeth says, go bid thy mistress, when my drink is ready she shall strike upon the bell. This is the signal. He said to Lady Macbeth in the previous scene, mock the time. So she's going to hit the bell, pretend that it's the bell from the telling the time, and that is when Macbeth is going to do the deed. So now we have this first line. We're going to look at this in a lot of detail. So is this a dagger which I see before me? Let's break this down. Is this a dagger I see before me? This is Macbeth seeing a dagger floating in the air in front of him. Now there are two interpretations that we can take from this. The first, is this a dagger created through poor mental health? Is this a dagger that he's seeing because his mind is plagued? Or is this something supernatural? Is this a vision sent by the witches to point Macbeth in the direction of Duncan's room, remind him of his purpose, convince him to commit this violent act? To say there is no right answer when coming across these quotations, when coming across multiple points of view, both could be correct, and it's really, really important that we talk about both of them. So if it's mental health, this could be a dagger created by guilt. It could be something that is leading him to his destruction. He sees the thing that he's guilty about, he sees the thing that he's worried about, he recognises that is going to lead to his destruction. As well, a dagger is a symbol of violence and power, but compare this dagger to his sword. So in Act 1, they talk about his sword smoked with bloody execution. This represents a change in the way that Macbeth is murdering. At the beginning of the play, he murders with his sword in battle. It's very honourable. Right now, he's going to murder with a dagger in sleep. So his murdering is slowly getting more and more dishonourable. Think a little bit about this. So if this was a supernatural dagger, if it's an illusion, what does it say about Macbeth's power? Who is in control? If the witches have sent this dagger to convince Macbeth to do it and to remind him what he's doing, then who is really in control of the situation? The witches, I would say. And finally, just as to consider maybe from a feminist reading or a psychoanalytical reading, you could think that a dagger is a symbol of masculinity. It links with murder, violence, death. You could argue it's phallic. Is this Macbeth trying to reclaim his masculinity through violence? Is this a direct response to what Lady Macbeth said to him and accused him of in the previous scenes? Okay, so try to make as many notes around that as you can, and really focus on that line. If you can remember that quotation, it gives you lots of things to talk about if Macbeth were to come up. And let's continue with the soliloquy. So, the handle toward my hand, this dagger is inviting Macbeth to violence. In the same way that you would have a handshake, the dagger is pointing towards his hand, pointing towards Duncan's room, inviting Macbeth to commit violence. He refers to it as a fatal vision. Again, this has an ambiguous meaning. Is the fatal vision to do with Duncan's death? Or is it a fatal vision to do with Macbeth's downfall? Does this fatal vision make him think about all of the terrible things that are going to come after this? Or is it purely around Duncan's death? Both could be argued. He talks about it being a dagger of the mind. He believes it is a hallucination, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain, the violent thoughts that he always has. A dagger of the mind as well is this symbolic of his desire. He desires to be king so much that his mind has conjured up the dagger that he's going to murder Duncan with. So I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. And Macbeth will pull out a real dagger now. Thou marshalst me the way that I was going. The dagger is pointing to Duncan, but marshalst. If you marshal someone, that again is to do with war, and there are connotations around war throughout this soliloquy. He says, "Mine eyes are made fools of the other senses." He believes that his brain is being tricked. This talks about a certain amount of weakness within Macbeth, that his brain is so easily tricked. We need to think about this now. Macbeth seems to know within this that he is being tricked, but he can't stop. He seems to recognise on a subconscious level that there is something not quite right about what's happening, and that maybe he isn't fully in control. Again, is this fate? Was he just meant to do this? Is it the witches controlling him? There are lots of ways we could look at it. He sees on the dagger, and this is another really good quotation to remember for his violence, "On thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before." So he sees on the fake dagger blood and gore, and all of the things that link with the violence of Duncan's death. He refers to it as bloody business, bringing back this motif of blood to refer to guilt now. The changing meaning of the symbol of blood. In the first act, blood was linked with heroism and bravery. Now, blood is linked with guilt and treason. Now, Macbeth talks a little bit about nature. He says, "Nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtain's sleep." So this shows that Macbeth understands that he is defying nature by killing Duncan, that he's going against the great chain of being, that he is breaking apart the divine right of kings, and he understands his punishment. He says, "Wicked dreams abuse the curtain's sleep," meaning that his dreams are meaning that he's not able to sleep, showing his punishment, foreshadowing his punishment. A little reference to the supernatural. Witchcraft celebrates Pale Hecate's offerings and all that kind of stuff. The wolf. This is another motif around nature and animals. Thinking about wolves being stealthy, predatory animals that would kill quietly if they could. Mentioning his stealthy pace. Now Tarquin, I've highlighted this, please note this, was a Roman tyrant who came in the night to rape his friend's wife, Lucretia. The story is a Shakespeare poem as well, but this is a reference to someone coming in the night to commit a violent act. That's foreshadowing on what Macbeth's about to do. And moves like a ghost. So foreshadowing definitely there around death, but also we'll see Banquo return as a ghost later in the play, so we could think that maybe this is foreshadowing that. In all of this foreshadowing, Shakespeare is just building up the ideas that are going to come about within the rest of the play. implanting these ideas like seeds in your mind, so that when they kind of flower, it all makes sense, it all links up. We then get more reference to God. Macbeth asks, "Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabouts." This backs up the idea that he doesn't want God to see what he's about to do, because of the great chain of being, because of the divine right of kings. He wants to take the present horror from the time. That's the deed that he will do. He wants it to be done. He wants fear and anxiety to be gone. And certainly once Duncan's murdered, he hopes that fear and anxiety will be over. Obviously it won't. And this is a nice quotation because, again, Macbeth says lots and lots of things that are similar to this, where he says, "Whiles I threat he lives, words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives." So he's saying that if he spends too long talking about the deed, then it will cool his purpose down. It will stop him wanting to do it. He's saying basically he needs less talk, more action. And we will see that later on in the play, where he says, "Let the very firstlings of my heart be the firstlings of my hand." He gives up thinking about his deeds. He just wants to act. Finally, Macbeth says, "I go and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell." This is further equivocation. And it links with that idea of fair is foul and foul is fair. We could say that Duncan is a good king because of his trust. He's a good king, and so he'll go to heaven because he's been really kind to the Scottish people. Or Duncan is a bad king because of his trust. He was very trusting of Macbeth. He was weak and in some ways fickle, so maybe he's going to go to hell because he was a bad king. This is the idea that with everyone there is a duality. There is a goodness and a badness, and God will decide whether Duncan is to heaven or to hell. I just want to run through a few points before I finish this. So this is a really nice idea. The violence of Duncan's death juxtaposes his softness and innocence. Throughout this, Shakespeare is trying to portray Duncan as a really good king, linking to King James in a way. And did Duncan deserve to die in such a horrible, horrible way? I'm not sure that he did. And by juxtaposing it, that emphasises how awful the act really is. If Macbeth was to do this to someone like Macduff, for example, he's quite a hard, gruff, soldierly person. If Macbeth were to murder him in his sleep, that would have a lot less impact than if he were to murder a soft, gentle king. A little note on the symbolism of blood. I talked about that just before. And then finally, just to really hammer home this idea of the great chain of being and the divine right of kings being the social structure of Jacobean society, we have God, kings, dukes, landowners, serfs, and then the animals of the kingdom. All of this is the hierarchy that is the great chain of being. And just finally to note that King James actually wrote a book on the divine right of kings, outlining the reasons that any king from lineage, any king with a legitimate claim, if you're the son or the daughter of a royal, should just be followed blindly, even if they are a tyrant. In this play, Macbeth does not have a legitimate claim. Malcolm has the legitimate claim. So, as we move forward, think about why nature and Scotland goes so wrong with a king on the throne that is illegitimate. Okay? So, that's Act 2. So that's Act 2, Scene 1. I hope you found it useful, and I'll speak to you guys soon. Bye bye.